That's what it was from the beginning. It's only secondarily clerical or active or charismatic in a particular way. It is fundamentally the Christian life, lived to a greater degree than most men and women can live it. Pope John Paul II took this very seriously when he promulgated his apostolic exhortation Orientale Lumen in 1995 and Vita Consecrata in 1996. Obviously, religious life, monastic life was very much in his mind. And both talk about the same sort of things, one from an Eastern perspective and one from a Western perspective. Very important. I'm not going to read it out, but you've got Orientale Lumen in your folders. And the opening paragraph, in fact, on the front page, it will tell you who it's addressed to. It's addressed to all the Catholic bishops, priests, religious and faithful of the Church. Not just the Eastern ones. All of them. That's very important. It's addressed to all of you, what's said in Orientale Lumen. And Vita Consecrata, of course, is addressed to everyone because we know that. And in fact, the Synod of Bishops, which it was based on, was attended by many Eastern Catholic monastics and bishops. All right, what can Eastern monasticism learn from the West? Now, I better keep my eye on the time. Okay. What can Eastern monasticism learn from the West? Absolutely nothing. We do everything better. No, I'm only kidding. I'm only kidding. But the fact is, because of the sheer numbers and success of the Western Church in the second millennium, to do with political power, with money, with all sorts of things, that has happened. The Eastern Church, for 1,000 years, has been the weaker partner. It's either been under Islamic occupation or more recently Soviet occupation. And so we've been weak. And so we haven't influenced the Latin Church. The Latin Church has influenced us, for the better and for the worse. For the better, in lots of ways. For the worse, when it comes to what His Excellency said about Latinization, where the only way was the Latin way. This narrowing down of what it means to be a Catholic. And that's had terrible results. I think the dissent in the Church is a big part of that. It's related. If they had that broadness of vision, and I will illustrate that in a moment, you could see that there is different ways of approaching to combat this dissension, to not making it so polarized, to present a more gentle middle approach that some apostolic churches have been doing all along. What can the Western Church, particularly Western monasticism, learn from Eastern monasticism? I would say that there are three emphases that are very important that in Western monasticism are present, but in Eastern monasticism are much more stressed, much more emphasized, much more integral, and I think make a big difference. And I think Western monasticism at this time of, to some degree, crisis, could benefit from hearing those. The first and the most important, and if I have time I'll explain it, is that Eastern monasticism, like the Eastern Church, always stresses much more the mystical element of the faith. The spiritual, we might call. What does mystical mean? It doesn't mean seeing visions and floating, just. It means sacramental. It means what in the Western Church and in the Eastern Church and the Western Church has been some controversy about, and I'm sure Father Hugh could tell you all about it. This developed definition, theological definition in the East called uncreated grace. It's a union with God that is deeper, that is at our souls, deeper than the intellect. Now how can contact with God be deeper than the intellect? I mean, how is that possible? But it must be, because God is beyond our intellectual grasp. And yet He still communicates with us on that level. That's what I mean by mysticism. I don't mean some pagan, Hindu understanding or practice. I don't mean extraordinary mystical experiences like you have in the West and in the East. I mean sacramental. I mean that realm in our soul where God communicates with us in prayer, that is deeper than the intellect, deeper than even formulated doctrine, which is an intellectual exercise. What doctrine tries to express. And we need to give this a valid place in our faith, an experiential place in our faith. And that's what Eastern monasticism, I think, can remind us, can help us do, because it's been much more integral there than in the West, at least in the second millennium. The other, I think, emphasis in the West is that monastic life is personal and charismatic, much more than institutional. And that's important. In the rule of St. Benedict wrote his rule for his monastery, but in the Benedictine order, the rule is pretty paramount. Now, it has to be interpreted by the abbot, but it's pretty paramount, what the rule says. In Eastern monasticism, the place of the rule, and each monastery has their own rule, the emphasis is much more on the relationship between the abbot or the abbess, the spiritual mother, and the spiritual children. It's a disciple relationship. That's much more emphasized in the West, in the East. Father Jim, would you stand up, please? Father Jim Bankston is a Ukrainian Catholic priest from San Diego. I'm very proud to say one of my spiritual children from before he became a priest, while he was still a layman. And thank you, Father Jim. I'm going to ask him to get up again in a minute, because he's a married priest with a family, and I want to bring that up too. But for the time being, to show you, Mother Anastasia, we call Mother. Why do we call all the sisters in the tradition, not in all Eastern traditions, but in most Eastern traditions, traditionally all fully tonsured nuns are called Mother. They're not called Sister. They're only called Sister when they're novices. Why? Because this emphasis on the parent and child, the discipleship aspect of passing on the faith. And the most important of all, the emphasis in Eastern monasticism is baptismal rather than clerical. And this has enormous, enormous implications for some of the hot button issues of the day. What do I mean that? Well, Pope John Paul II says in Orientale Lumen, monastic life, he's talking specifically as it's stressed in the East, monastic life, listen to it very carefully, this is very, very paramount. Monastic life is the reference point for all the baptized. Now we could reword that to say monastic life is the reference point for the priesthood of all believers, right? That's what baptism is. And this is very, very fundamental, because I think it can address a lot of very hot button issues in the Latin West.